could you say a bit more about your point about the global information war, alt-right libertarians versus the rule-based order?
It's interesting, and it's quite hazy and quite difficult to kind of pin down exactly what we exactly what we mean, I suppose, by that alt-right development. But this kind of idea that the way in which this sort of idea of well, that there was a sort of a Western establishment. I mean, some of it takes over language from the left, and some of it takes over language from the kind of libertarian right, I suppose. And so you kind of see, for example, I think it was in the Spectator this weekend, Lionel Shriver writing about sort of saying, well, the West has sort of weakened its preoccupation with sort of diversity and wokeness is what has weakened the West and has emboldened Putin to invade, and that kind of thing. And so making those kinds of connections, or Brendan O'Neill writing in Spiked about, or actually I think it was a similar kind of argument about wokeness and about sort of about decadence, and then, as I think I mentioned in the talk, the way in which suddenly, I think this in particular has emerged in Australia, that the anti-vaxxers in Australia are sort of coming out and speaking in favour of Putin, which is kind of slightly weird because Putin is, hides himself away with great fear from kind of COVID. And so you can see these kind of rather sort of quite different kinds of political positions that somehow, I mean, it's difficult to say because it's very emergent, but that somehow that the Ukraine war has clarified these rather divergent kinds of positions, so that one can see very clearly how the people who are kind of either lining up with Putin or trying to say, well, there are two sides to this, and we shouldn't take a side, which is what some of the people, which is an argument that some of the people have sort of carried over from the anti-vax stuff, are sort of saying, well, or we can look at, what different scientists are saying, and there's dissensus between them, and therefore there isn't a clear consensus here. And so somehow one can see both the content and the form of that narrative coalescing, so that we can sort of see more clearly who is on the one side and who is on the other. And perhaps there's something about the actual outbreak of military conflict that makes those things easier to see, because information conflicts in their nature are kind of somewhat kind of intangible, right? And so that, I think, is what I meant by that.
Okay, yeah. So what you're really saying is we're just in a very fluid period politically, and we're getting this fundamental realignment. Would that be a fair summary?
Well, it feels to me as if we're having a very sudden, very quick realignment. It feels like a very different world to the world that it was even kind of 3 weeks ago. Now, in one way, that's kind of nonsense, because if we're talking about Russian military aggression in Ukraine, I mean, that has been going on since 2014. But on the other hand, in terms of the way that the narratives have shifted in the West anyway around this, that seems to be happening very much at kind of pace. And of course, a lot will depend on how things play out, I suppose, on the ground in Ukraine. And of course, I may be completely wrong, but I just have this sort of feeling as if certain kinds of sort of like tectonic sort of plates of public discourse have shifted in the last few weeks compared with what we've seen before.
The issue of the EU as a vehicle to promote peace was completely ignored during the referendum, and I think that's really coming to the fore now. That, as you say, that countries within the EU are not going to attack each other, you know, and I think that that's going to come much more to the fore. What do you think?
Well, I mean, again, I mean, yes and no, because I mean, it was about peace between its members, you know, so I don't think that particularly speaks to the issue about what's happening in Ukraine, which isn't a member. I mean, I think where I would perhaps go, I mean, not to say I agree with you, of course, about the role of the EU in terms of its membership, and we only need to look at what's happening in Ukraine to think to ourselves, thank God, Poland and Bulgaria and Romania and joined when they did. What would be happening in those countries now? Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. What would be happening in those countries now if they were not members of the EU? So I absolutely agree with you. But I think the other thing, and actually we probably have to admit that Brexit has been helpful in this, is that I think that now that the EU no longer has the UK inside it, constantly saying we shouldn't be cooperating on defence, we shouldn't be cooperating on foreign policy, we shouldn't be cooperating on, well, security even, although that would be slightly overstating it, but certainly defence and foreign policy, that these ideas about strategic autonomy of the European Union, meaning the development of yes, defence, foreign policy, but also kind of technological autonomy and so on, we can see those becoming much more realistic now. And of course, it's also incredibly significant. This is one of the reasons I say that so many tectonic plates are shifting. It's incredibly significant what Germany has decided in the last couple of weeks. It's significant for Germany, but also significant for the European Union as well, in terms of the EU recognizing itself to be both not just a sort of an economic superpower, but increasingly to be a diplomatic and perhaps even ultimately a significant sort of military power as well. And that was kind of, yeah, so, you know, so I think that is how I would respond to that, that it's about, yes, about peace amongst its members, but it's also about security for its members.
I'm in Cheltenham for Europe. We're one of the sort of active on the ground for Europe groups, mainly active with sort of newsletters and in social media, but we're thinking about going out on the street and producing leaflets. So, you know, what's the right sort of tone? You know, we need to point out the very many flaws with Brexit, but as you say, you know, with the momentous events going on in Ukraine, you know, it's just finding the right way to sort of say things and not go on about all the, you know, things that people might consider to be inconsequential given, you know, given the mayhem and carnage in the Ukraine in Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah. I think, you know, I think that is really, really difficult, and you know, I mean, I thought was very kind of sensitive to this myself the other day when I wrote the blog about this, because I was thinking that is how people think. I mean, maybe, to be honest with you, Sarah, maybe it isn't quite exactly the right time to be doing stuff on the streets about Brexit just at the moment, you know, because of the reasons that you say, and that maybe, you know, even in the tragic truth about this is that even if the war goes on being extremely bloody, it will gradually drop off the top of the news headlines. Yeah, we know that because we know that's how the news cycle works. And so in sort of a couple of weeks' time, even, you know, I mean, it would be lovely, of course, if there was a kind of a Hollywood ending to all this and David beats Goliath, and, you know, that's it. But that's probably kind of, you know, that's probably sort of optimistic. And gradually, other things, not just Brexit, other things will come back more legitimately onto the news agenda, and so it may be easier to be out and about on the streets. Just you know, that's not necessarily very long away, I think. And my other thought about it, though, which sort of goes back to this thing about, you know, suppose it's right, it may be wrong, but suppose that I'm right to say, based on what the opinion polls were suggesting, that there is maybe going to be a space where Brexiters are going to be, or Leave voters, or one-time Leave voters, are going to sort of be perhaps because of Ukraine, beginning to kind of think, really, what was that all about? Which is almost the flip side of the point that you've made, that precisely because it now seems, perhaps in bad taste, or however you put it, to be going out and talking about relatively trivial issues, that you can flip that round and see that for people who are very pro-Brexit, who were very pro-Brexit, that maybe they themselves also, it flips around for them, and they suddenly think, gosh, actually, was I really that bothered about that? And that then opens up a space potentially for some conversations that have been difficult before. And there, I think the key is that not to kind of talk in terms of, well, doesn't this show how you got the whole thing wrong then? But actually kind of, but just being more sort of, there's always a tendency with all the Brexit stuff to sort of say, oh, well, we told you so, when the farmer says, oh, I haven't got my subsidy anymore. And you say, well, you had a bloody great sign in your field saying leave the EU. What did you expect, dimwit? But that's not politically a very astute thing to say, right? So, and so I think, again, maybe I'm completely wrong, but if I'm right that a moment is opening up because of the Ukraine crisis, that people may be more open to thinking, then, so two things then is a long-winded answer to what you're saying, but I really recognize the importance of the thing, which is, firstly, maybe things need to go off the boil a bit, and secondly, when they do, be magnanimous and sort of,
My question is, will joint talks, EU and UK, will joint talks on Ireland go on forever? And if not, how not? Thanks.
You mean on Northern Ireland specifically?
It's the protocol is called the Protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Sure, I mean, it can't, in one level, you think it can't go on forever. It seems pretty clear, no, that it's now that it's going to go on. It's effectively in stasis. It's going to go on beyond the Northern Ireland Assembly elections. So that already is going to take us into, and then if you add a bit more on after that, that takes us through to, sort of June, July, doesn't it? Then it's the kind of the summer season, the summer holiday season where everybody goes away. So it's pretty easy to think of it going on in September. But then on the other hand, you kind of got, in the meantime, it seems as if everything is frozen in terms of the grace period extensions, in terms of the legal action that the EU have taken. All of that will then be suspended. And I think that there are, and eventually there kind of comes a point, and I think there are some people in the in some parts of the kind of Brexit community, if you like, who have this almost hope that if things go on and on like this unresolved, with key parts of the protocol not implemented, then that becomes the de facto sort of reality, and it becomes possible to say, well, that's the reality on the ground. Why do we actually need to be implementing, full SPS checks or whatever? We've now got through. By that time it will be sort of a year and 3 quarters or something like that. Perhaps getting towards 2 years since the end of the transition period, and then people said, look, why has there been any adverse consequence? So that would, perhaps then, almost sort of by default mean that certain key parts of the protocol don't get implemented. I mean, I don't know, and I know who you are, and you may well know a lot more about this than I do, but I don't think there's any legal reason. There's no date in law. Except, of course, the other thing which is going to happen is that there's going to be the consent vote in the Northern Ireland Assembly on the continuation of the protocol.
Oh, yes.
And that's due in 2024, I think I'm right to say. And so that's a complexity as well, because what will that vote be about if it's not implemented? And then, of course, not overlaying all of that, but side by side with that, is the fact that we are also then going to be getting into the point about the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So that's due for 5-year review. So that's going to be, say, 2025. Now, obviously, that's not about the protocol as such, but the thinness and thickness of the agreement in the TCA inevitably has an impact on the thinness and thickness of the border requirements with respect to GBNI. So you can almost, so what I'm kind of saying is, if I'm right to say, which I think I am, that there's no kind of legal thing which would stop this going on, then you could see a situation whereby it goes on for so long that it gets entangled up with the next kind of stage of things. And so it could be a very long time. It could be a very long time. Well, I don't know. What do you think? Because I think you might have.
Well, if the chair's happy, I'll come back briefly. Yeah, I think it will go on for a long time. You know, a 2024 consent vote will certainly be interesting, but I think more interesting from my own point of view is how it plays into the next general election for the UK as a whole. Because assuming the stalemate has continued until that point, what will each of the parties say in the general election about Brexit, given this backdrop that, as it were, we're still stuck on Ireland?
And I mean, going back to what I've been talking about today, I mean, you could envisage the Ukraine thing playing into that as well, in this sense that you know, if we do have perhaps a generally more harmonious and cooperative tone with the EU over kind of security, then it then becomes a bit kind of slightly absurd, this sort of thing of, well, why won't you do SPS alignment, for example? You know? So but anyway, it's a good point to the question about but I mean, the whole question about how the parties are going to position themselves with respect to the EU and or post-Brexit policy with respect to the EU is going to be quite an interesting one in terms of kind of manifestos. And it's obviously a bit early to kind of tell with them, but you know, the assumption is that the Lib Dems are going to go in with something which is fairly explicitly looking for, you know, probably a series of steps towards closer, towards kind of closer relationship. But the really key question will be, what will Labour say about this? And that's, you know, I mean, all of the noises. Yeah, that's to be discovered. I mean, all of the noises would suggest that they will also be talking in terms of a closer, better relationship. But I suspect that they won't set out. I could envisage the Lib Dems setting out a series of kind of concrete steps that they want to have, whereas I think Labour are more likely to not have any kind of concrete steps, but just give some examples of areas where there could be improved, some, you know, sort of cooperation or sort of something like that. And presumably the Tories will go in sort of saying, well, you know, well, depending what's happened with the protocol, but we'll be kind of saying, you know, well, you know, I think they will really want to just say, well, this is all yesterday's issue. We delivered that for you, and now we're moving on. Something like that. Yeah.
We've heard arguments from Brexit supporters that the EU doesn't constitute the quote, the world's greatest peace project. Now, do we think that the Ukrainian president's recent keenness to submit his application for EU membership demonstrates how valuable the EU is to peace in Europe?
Yeah, and you know, I mean, that begs the thing about the contribution of the EU to peace in Europe. I mean, they always twisted it, because they would sort of say, oh well, firstly they would say, oh, but it's NATO, and secondly they would say, well, if Europe is so good at keeping the peace, then how do you explain the Yugoslav civil wars? And of course this was utterly, and even if there are people now, some of the Brexiters now, who are saying, well, the very fact of war in Ukraine proves that the EU doesn't need peace. The point, of course, about the EU as a peacekeeper was the idea of that it made it unthinkable of the members of the EU to go to war with each other, not that the existence of the EU prevented war in non-EU countries. I mean, of course, now, you know, I mean, the idea of a very quick accession has come onto the sort of the table, but the idea it was there before. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that it wasn't provoked by this latest Russian aggression. I mean, belonging to the EU was part of the Ukraine dream, if you like, for Europeanization and and for Westernization, and ensure part of that was, absolutely a peace. And there's something very ironic, isn't there, about at one end of Europe, countries desperately wanting to get in, whilst here at the other end of the continent we've left.
My question really was whether you could go a bit further down the line of interpretation that basically Johnson was bought by Putin and has been basically a Putin asset, more or less, since at least the middle of the decade, if not further forward, and that Johnson has a role to look after the laundrette, which we started recently talking about again. The laundrette is essential to Putin's kleptocratic operation. London has an essential role. We're very much aware of that at the moment. This is a major embarrassment for Johnson in his current situation. And that that kind of business link between Brexit, Johnson's role, Putin, and the current difficulties is a bit more of a kind of crucial factor possibly than the overall account you've given explicitly allows for.
I mean, Colin, that's much too strong for me. I think, I think we would have to have a lot more proof and a lot more evidence to sustain the depth of the connection that you're kind of putting there. And I mean, I've never been somebody who's been really persuaded by the idea that there was, that in some ways, let me finish the sentence, that there was this huge depth of influence of Russia on the Brexit referendum. So let's start with that. And I think in a way, it is a way that people in Britain have refused to face up to their own responsibilities, both at the time of the referendum and for decades before the referendum, in terms of our failure, collective failure to articulate the pro-EU case and the case for EU membership. And then when it all comes tumbling down, we say, oh, well, it was the Russians who did it to us. I'm not trying to say that there wasn't any Russian interest in what happened, but I think that the monocular focus on Brexit on Russia as a kind of cause of Brexit is overstated. And to be brutally frank, if Johnson and Britain were Russian assets in the way that you suggest, then Britain would not be conducting itself in the way that it has done in the United Nations Security Council. It would be, we can put it this way, if Britain has been bought, then Putin hasn't really got that much for it in terms of international support from Britain for his regime. So I think it's a kind of a overblown and slightly paranoid rhetoric.
You mentioned earlier that you don't follow the idea that there was any collusion towards Brexit. If we just leave Brexit out for a minute, do you think there's any mileage in bringing out the corrupt money that's obviously been around London, and whether there's any corrupt money that's particularly affected, or any Russian money that's particularly influenced the Conservative Party?
Oh, yes, I do. And let me correct you, or if necessary, correct myself. I didn't say it dismiss the idea of any collusion.
Okay.
The point that I was making is not to focus on that as if every time anybody says Brexit, the cause of Brexit was X, or the real agenda of Brexit was Y, they are always wrong. It doesn't matter what the X is, it doesn't matter what the Y is. And that's the same true when it's Russia, when it's about saying it's Russian influence. So I did not say, and I do not think, I think it's very murky and difficult to tell exactly what went on, but that's not the same as saying, saying and how much influence it had and so on. But there was something there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is absolutely no. I mean, I completely agree with you about that. And I mean, this idea, which is the current kind of line of Conservative Party defense on Russian funding, is to say, well, everything we took was within the letter of the law. Well, we're not accusing them, or they are not being accused of taking the money illegally. What is the question that is being asked is by taking the money, what influence did that buy? whose interests are you now serving? You know, that I think is absolutely, you know, a really kind of is a massively important question. And again, you know, a positive thing that may come out of this Ukraine war is that may be, it may be more and more difficult for the Conservative Party to avoid that question.
Thanks for that. Do you think now's the right time to be really focusing on that?
Well, it's almost inevitable that you know that it's coming out now because of you know, I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it, on the one hand, to be saying for a government to be saying you know, to be condemning and sanctioning Russia with one hand, and to be taking money with the other hand. I mean, it's, you know, so I think it's almost inevitable that the more that where there's a focus on the front hand bit, there's bound to be a bit more emphasis on the backhand bit. It's
really about the end game of the current behaviour of Johnson as Prime Minister, and I've always wondered this: what is the role for Remainers in Britain in the future? Because there's clearly so many of us, we're not going anywhere. So what is actually envisaged for us?
Yeah, you know, and I mean, it's an interesting question. There's kind of at multiple levels. You know, I've always felt that one of the big ironies about Brexit was the fact that when it came to actually delivering it, that the people who were expected to deliver it in terms of in the civil service or in businesses or in civil society, well, we don't know. They were not necessarily all Remainers, but the demographics of the Brexit vote would suggest that a high proportion of those people were Remainers, and yet they were charged with delivering it. And so that, you know, so partly in response to saying what is the place of Remainers, it seems to be the place of Remainers in Brexit Britain seems to be to, you know, to keep your mouth shut and make it work, even though you've been asked to deliver something which is totally sort of unworkable. But the more specific thing about this world-beating rhetoric, I mean, it's interesting that, isn't it? I mean, of course, you know, it's not something that just came with Johnson, and I mean, I think it's a sort of, you know, I mean, I think there's a much longer story here to be told about the whole of Britain's post-war history and its inability really to have adapted itself to the changing world since 1945, the world of you know, end of empire and all of those kinds of things, and in a way it seemed as if with decolonization and with joining Europe in the 1970s, that maybe there was the beginning of that and the finding of a new role, but then it became sort of overlaid by this kind of extraordinary kind of sort of Falklands flag waving in the 1980s and so on, and there was never really any kind of any sort of narrative about Britain in the world, or Britain sort of learning its place in the world, something like that. So it's not just Johnson, but he's clearly particularly addicted to it. Does he believe in it? You know, it's impossible to tell with Johnson. The more you read about him as a character, the more you think he doesn't actually believe in anything particularly at all, except, you know, except you know, himself, his own entitlement, his own ambition, and just sort of getting through the next day. But he's clearly, on the other hand, to speak to your point B, you know, that it is a very significant thing for his base, and he's kind of cottoned onto this thing that, you know, and most people in that voting base, they don't necessarily know. You know, if you sort of say, well, okay, you know, we're taking the lead in organizing sanctions against Russia, for example. I mean, it's a very nebulous kind of notion, that, isn't it? You know, and who can really sort of, I mean, if you kind of like dig into who was at particular meetings and when and where, you know, in a specialized way, you can certainly sort of, you know, discredit that. But most people are not kind of going to do that, and so you just kind of hear, oh, that sounds, you know, and most people have very little idea of how Britain is seen from abroad. You know, because most people don't read the foreign media, for one thing, and so I think he does clearly have some sort of function for his base, and to pissing it off detractors. well, I don't know about him, but I mean, for sure, that must be the motive of, you know, a lot of people in the kind of commentariat. And I don't know if he has if he has an end game, but I think it's kind of, I suspect it's something to do with, you know, he's obviously got this kind of wet dream about Churchill, although he's not alone in that either. And I think maybe he has this hope of, you know, I'm going to be down in the history books as a great, you know, as the great leader of my people who restored their faith in themselves. So, you know, I suspect that's what he kind of believes. You know.